the idea that the world is just so convenient for everyone in the business world that doing what's kind of maximally good from the perspective of profit making will just always be consistent with kind of doing their part from a moral perspective to kind of address the threat of climate change. This seems so improbable that there's just no good reason to believe it, right? I mean, there's no evidence that tends to be kind of presented for this. It's generally kind of highly speculative.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. We'll be covering a diverse range of topics, bringing you the latest insights and knowledge that you can apply to your life and to work. So get ready to dive into new ideas with The Ripple Effect. Let me start, I guess, just where your interest around the issue of ethics and climate change really kind of formulated.
Yeah, so I wrote my dissertation, finished all the way back in 2012, on our obligations to the global poor. That was kind of the case that kind of focused my kind of theorizing. And one of the issues that I discussed is kind of how demanding our obligations can be. There's kind of a debate in moral philosophy about what we call the demandingness of morality, how much relatively well-off people are obligated to sacrifice in order to make the world a better place, relieve suffering, help people who are unjustly disadvantaged, and so on. And similar issues arise, of course, with respect to climate change, although there the challenge is that the main kind of moral obligation that it seems like we have is to protect environmental conditions for future generations, for people who don't already exist. And there are a lot of kind of interesting philosophical puzzles about how we can have obligations to future people who don't yet exist, what the nature of those obligations might be, how we can explain them. And then our answers to these questions have implications for what and exactly how much we ought to do in the face of the threat of climate change. And so that was a set of issues that I kind of took up after finishing my dissertation when I was in my first postdoctoral position.
How much do you think the question of ethics around climate change comes up in a lot of the conversation today? I think, you get a lot about the data and where we need to go, but I'm wondering if the ethics side of it and the obligations, as you said, the moral obligations of companies and people kind of in this process comes up enough.
So I don't think it comes up enough. I think there's a divide. I think there are kind of people who have certain kinds of approaches to thinking about the challenge of climate change that are such that, in effect, they really are kind of generally talking about ethics, even if they're not kind of talking about it the way that, people like me who are trained in moral philosophy talk about it, right? But they're thinking about, am I required to, drive less and live in a smaller home and fly less and, eat a vegan diet and, do all of the kinds of things that we as individuals can do to reduce our contributions to climate change. They're also thinking about things like what sort of public policies we ought to have, what sort of regulations we ought to have, and thinking about it in the way that's characteristic of ethical reasoning, right? They're thinking about what does justice require that we do for future generations, and so on. In other circles, discussions of ethics seem to me to happen much less, right? The goal that others have in kind of thinking about how we ought to approach climate change seems to be like trying to figure out kind of technical solutions or kind of win-win solutions, ways that we might be able to kind of make progress on dealing with climate change without any of the relevant actors having to really sacrifice anything, right? And to the extent that it's possible, to deal with climate change in this kind of way, we should kind of take advantage of those opportunities. But the worry that I have about this is that it may not be possible to do that. And, we're kind of now especially short on time, right? We haven't done nearly enough for 30 plus years, and so limiting our discussions to something like the question of is there a way that we can reduce our emissions enough to keep warming under 2 degrees or under 1.5 degrees without having to sacrifice anything in the way of our current lifestyles or corporate profits or other kinds of things that might, in fact, actually need to be kind of traded off against the aim of addressing climate change in a serious way. I think it's kind of dangerous to kind of approach the issue only in that way.
So then potentially, are we kind of in a pivot moment, do you think, at this time in terms of what's occurred in the past, where we are at the moment, and obviously, as you said, where we need to go in a relatively short time, that this is the time where action is very important to move forward?
I mean, action is certainly important at this point. We've done far too little for a very long time, since we've known about the threat that climate change poses, and we really are running out of time. Right? The experts now seem to think that we basically have less than 10 years at this point to bring about a pretty radical shift in emissions trajectories. I mean, if we're going to reach the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, the most recent estimates suggest that we need to get to net zero emissions globally by 2050. And we need to make significant reductions by 2030. That requires a great deal of change in a very short amount of time. And given that what we've seen over the past 30 plus years is relatively little progress, the sort of shift that is required is, to some extent, kind of hard to get our minds around, right? I mean, it would be quite transformational in ways that it's not obvious that we're prepared for.
You've talked in other interviews and other papers, I remember, about a climate imperative for business. Take us through what that is and how you think this will factor in.
Yeah, so I've got a paper that my colleague Eric Orts and I have been working on, in which we argue that approaches to business decision making that have kind of become standard, over the last, say, 50 years or so, that involve focusing at least primarily, if not exclusively, on increasing profits kind of within the limits of the law, has to be rejected in a pretty significant way in the face of the threat of climate change. The climate imperative idea is that whatever approach to business decision making we endorse, it has to be consistent with a kind of serious commitment to do what's necessary kind of within business practices to sufficiently address the climate threat. And so the imperative says that each business decision maker, say, an executive of a corporation, is obligated to take the threat of climate change into account in their decision making in a way that leads them to ensure that their firm's emissions are kind of no higher than is compatible with basically doing their fair share, right? Kind of on the assumption that everyone else is doing their fair share too, in order to ensure that we kind of do enough to mitigate the threat of climate change. And for a lot of firms, that would require pretty radically transforming the way that they do business and the way that their key decision makers go about reasoning about, how operations are going to be structured and what priorities are going to be. This is just necessary if we're going to successfully deal with the threat.
So there is also the argument that climate imperative and profit maximizing are compatible. How do you look at that?
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was talking about a little bit before. So some people um, suggest, not always, all that explicitly, but they seem to kind of have in mind that uh, firms don't really have to give up much, if anything, in the way of profits in order to kind of do their part when it comes to dealing with climate change. People talk about, opportunities to kind of shift business models in ways that will, be even more profitable in the future. But there's a degree of optimism that comes out of some quarters that seems to me, at the very least, exaggerated. Um, the idea that the world is just so convenient for everyone in the business world that doing what's kind of maximally good from the perspective of profit making will just always be consistent with kind of doing their part from a moral perspective to kind of address the threat of climate change just seems so improbable that um, there's just no good reason to believe it, right? I mean, there's no evidence that tends to be kind of presented for this. It's generally kind of highly speculative, and of course, there's something appealing about this kind of optimism. It would be great if the world were like this, and sometimes there are these sort of fortunate situations where there aren't kind of serious trade-offs that have to be made between competing priorities. But the world isn't always like that. One of the obvious examples to point to, of course, is oil companies, companies that are in the fossil fuel extraction business. If you kind of look at um, their plans, right? I mean, there were some articles that got some attention back in, I think, 2019, 2020, that highlighted that a number of the major global fossil fuel firms uh, are planning increased extraction up through about 2030 or the early 2030s. That's their current business plan. And so those who think that there's no conflict between profit maximizing and the climate imperative have to either think that the decision makers at these firms are just really bad business people. They're really bad at pursuing profits in the best possible way. They're just making a kind of deep mistake about what's going to be best in terms of profits for their firms, because that's surely that's kind of what's driving these decisions. But in fact, if the optimists are right, these firms would do better by planning to reduce extraction and move in different directions. But that just seems like it's unlikely to be true. Right? The people who are making these decisions are well informed. They kind of know what they're doing. They're competent business people. From my perspective, they're just making decisions that are ethically problematic. Right?
Yeah.
They're not kind of taking the moral importance of dealing with the climate threat sufficiently seriously. But they probably are doing what's best in terms of profits for their firms.
Right, and that hence brings us to the topic of greenwashing, which is a term that comes up quite often these days, and basically the philosophy of a company saying one thing and doing another, basically looking out for the profits and maybe not necessarily looking out for what they said that they were going to do. And I guess the question is, how prevalent do you think that is these days, and how much impact is it having on the overall discussion around climate right now to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think it's fairly common. Right? There is, I think, increasing pressure on firms to say the right things about their commitments on climate and kind of environmental issues more broadly. Um, Unfortunately, for kind of reasons having to do with the kind of, information that ordinary individuals can kind of realistically kind of process and so on. there's less pressure on firms to actually do all of the good things that they might be claiming to do. It's often possible for firms to kind of engage in um, rhetoric that makes it kind of sound like they have all these really good commitments without,
Yeah.
you know, doing nearly as much as the rhetoric suggests they're doing. And given that, there's still a kind of dominant practice in business decision making of aiming, again, primarily, if not exclusively, at maximizing profits within constraints like the law, um, it's not surprising that it's fairly common for firms to kind of exaggerate how much good they're doing for climate or kind of other other important purposes. Um, in large part as a kind of marketing tool, right? Given that a lot of people do care about these issues.
So then what do you think needs to change at this point, playing off of the mindset that, as you alluded to before, that change needs to occur, and it needs to occur in a fairly quick fashion in order to be able to meet some of the targets that experts have talked about? What needs to change, either from a corporate or a public perspective angle, in order to make the change and get to the right level of dealing with this issue?
Yeah, I mean, quite a few things need to change. I mean, we're in a situation where we need to accomplish a great deal in a short period of time and make pretty significant changes to, the way that businesses do things, the way that kind of we as individuals do things in our personal lives, and so on. I mean, there are kind of multiple dimensions to kind of what needs to happen. So, as Eric Gortz and I have argued, one of the things that needs to happen is that the norms for business decision making need to change in some pretty significant ways. Corporate executives and kind of others who have impacts on the way that businesses operate need to be taking the threat of climate change much more directly into account than they have been for a long time in deciding what the policies of their organizations are going to look like, what practices they're going to adopt, and things like this. And sometimes they're going to have to make choices that involve sacrificing at least some degree of profitability for the sake of making a greater contribution to dealing with the threat of climate change. The other side of that is we all, as consumers, need to change the way that we think about kind of how we interact with firms, what kinds of purchasing decisions we make. Ultimately, dealing with the threat of climate change is going to require, I think, some fairly significant cultural changes. Right, people need to be willing to make some choices about how they kind of live their own lives that are different
Yeah.
from the ones that we're used to making. So we need to buy less stuff that's emissions intensive to produce. We need to be willing to kind of take public transit when it's available rather than driving everywhere. It'd be good if people lived in smaller homes that use less energy to heat and cool, and things like this. I mentioned earlier, adopting a vegan or at least a vegetarian diet, is one way of reducing one's kind of personal contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. It's morally good for other reasons too. So there are all kinds of things like this, and of course, the choices at the different levels impact each other, right? The more consumer behavior changes in the directions that I'm describing, the more that firms will have to um, change their business practices to kind of cater to the changing consumer preferences, right? So,
Right.
if a lot of people start adopting a vegan diet, right, that's going to require um, companies that are producing meat and dairy to produce less and maybe move into producing different kinds of options that are less carbon intensive. And the same goes for kind of other areas in which we might change our choices as individuals.
So can you look out then 5 years, 10 years, and think about where you think we need to be at that point? And I would say it's not even hoping, but wanting to see significant change and where we might be on a lot of these issues in the next decade or so.
Yeah. It's hard to kind of paint a detailed picture in our minds of kind of what the world would have to look like if we're going to kind of actually succeed in dealing with the threat. One of the sources of some optimism is that younger people seem to care about this issue a great deal. That's not surprising. They're going to be around a lot longer than people who are a bit older, and are going to have to live through some of the the really kind of troubling effects that we're already starting to see now. So certain kinds of policy changes that have been resisted for a long time might be possible as more and more younger people are involved in the political process, and frankly, as kind of more members of older generations are no longer around to vote. But there's some concern about that too, because there are kind of structural incentives in the climate change case to always kind of put off action a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer, right? Because when we actually do start doing more, in a serious way to kind of address the threat, then at least if I'm right, that's likely to involve some genuine sacrifices for people who are around when we start making those changes. And it's always kind of easy to say, well, a little bit longer won't hurt. A little bit longer won't hurt. Right? There's some kind of interesting philosophical papers that kind of highlight in detail kind of why this structure makes dealing with a problem like climate change so challenging. It's unlike most of the other problems that we've faced in society and kind of globally throughout history.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.